Good afternoon, good morning, depending on where you are. My name is Peter Lowen. I'm the director of the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. And it's my distinct pleasure to welcome you today to this conversation between the Honorable Kevin Rudd and the Honorable John Baird about Kevin Rudd's new book, The Avoidable War, The Dangers of a Catastrophic Conflict Between the U.S. and Xi Jinping's China. It's my pleasure certainly to welcome you to the University of Toronto. If you are here, where I am, we're sitting on the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. And we feel very fortunate to be able to live and to work on this land. I'm going to make introductions of our two guests, and then I'm going to turn it over to them to talk about Kevin's new book. And then I'd invite you through the course of the talk to submit any questions and answers, questions that you have, and we'll get some answers for them with the Q&A function on Zoom. So our two guests today should be well known to all of you, I'm sure, but I'll just do a quick introduction of them. Our host for the event, in a sense, is the Honorable John Baird. Of course, is well known to many of you as a member of Parliament in Canada from 2006 to 2015. Before that, a member of the provincial Parliament. He served in various roles in the Government of Canada, including President of the Treasury Board, Minister of Infrastructure and Communities, and perhaps most notably as Canada's Minister of Foreign Affairs from 2011 to 2015. When he was in that role, he actually overlapped with our other guest, Kevin Rudd. Kevin Rudd was a member of Parliament for Griffith in Australia from 98 to 2013. He was, of course, most notably the Prime Minister of Australia from 2007 to 2010, the last Labour leader in Australia to win a majority government, and was Prime Minister again in 2013. And in the interim, from 2010 to 2013, was Australia's Minister of Foreign Affairs. He is, for those of you who know him well, a very keen observer of China, not least because he's fluent in Mandarin and has spent much of his professional life in and out of China. So Kevin is now the president of the Asia Society based in New York City, but he's joining us from Queensland. So Kevin, it's a wonderful pleasure to have you here. John, likewise. I'm going to turn it over to you, Kevin, to talk about the premise of this new book of yours. And then, like everyone else, I'm going to sit back and look forward to a conversation between you and John Baird. Kevin, it's over to you.
Thank you very much, Peter, and thank you to all of our friends at Munk. It's good to be able to join you today. And John Baird, my former foreign ministerial colleague from Canada, thank you for taking time out as well. And the subject that we're discussing, which is the future of U.S. China relations, and particularly the question of whether crisis, conflict, and war between the U.S. and China is possible, probable, avoidable, or unavoidable, is one which actually haunts the minds of policymakers around the world, particularly in the light of the revisitation of the reality of war that we've seen with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The book, entitled The Avoidable War, really has two or three core arguments. The first is that because the balance of power between China and the United States has changed dramatically in recent times, and because of the nature of Xi Jinping's leadership style, we now have a significantly more assertive and the perception of many aggressive China than we did even a decade ago, both regionally and globally. And furthermore, the United States, since the second Obama administration, in particular under Trump, with the new national security strategy drafted by H.R. McMaster, the national security advisor of the Trump administration, and now continued through the Biden administration, has pushed back. And we are now into an age of strategic competition. That is the reality. And the object of that competition is in fact which country emerges as the dominant power in the Asia-Pacific, the Indo-Pacific, and in time, globally. Under Xi Jinping, the global aspiration is to bring about, quote, the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, unquote, which when put into a Chinese historical context is for China once again to be the dominant power in the world. Second, given that reality and that we are into an age of strategic competition, whether we choose to be there or not, the current nature of that competition is one which is, frankly, unmanaged. There are no guardrails, there are no guidelines, there are no rules of the road. In fact, what we have between the US and China is a daily experiment in push and shove, militarily, economically, and almost technologically as well. By which I mean there are an infinite series of potential incidents which can emerge from time to time from US and Chinese military assets in the South China Sea, in and around Taiwan, and around the East China Sea, in the latter case involving only Japan and not the US directly. But Japan is a US treaty ally, any of which could actually create an incident which could then escalate and then become crisis, become conflict, and become war. That's the nature of where we are now, unmanaged strategic competition. Which brings me to the third point of the book. The book then outlines an alternative, which I call managed strategic competition. And this may seem far-fetched to some who think that simply we're engaged in various forms of survival of the fittest, where there are no rules of the road other than to prevail against your opponent. But even during the last 30 years of the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States, there were basic rules of the road, which after the near-death experience of the Cuban Missile Crisis caused both Moscow and Washington in that period to develop basic protocols and how to manage what was then a highly destabilized relationship between the two of them. And finally, what I argue in the case of China and the US within this framework of managed strategic competition is an approach which has three essential characteristics. One, each side should identify their strategic red lines around Taiwan, South China Sea, East China Sea, the Korean Peninsula, and cyber and space, so that each side is under no illusion about what the ultimate strategic position is of Washington and Beijing in and around each of these five sets of highly destabilizing issues. At present, it's a case of push and shove and see where you define those red lines operationally. I think in the current environment, that is a highly unstable way in which to prosecute the relationship. The second element of managed strategic competition is if that can be done between Washington and Beijing in a manner which is somewhat analogous to what happened in the period of the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union, then that creates, therefore, space for what I describe as non-lethal strategic competition in all other aspects of the relationship. Other aspects of national security policy, foreign policy, trade, investment, technology, and the great competition unfolding now in terms of the ideology or system of ideas between the liberal democratic and liberal democratic capitalist world of the United States and its democratic allies around the world on the one hand, and China and its view of authoritarian state capitalism and the set of worldviews which that reflects as China seeks to develop its own alternative to the international rules-based system. And the final element of this three-part framework is still to create sufficient political and diplomatic space for strategic collaboration to occur, where that is necessary for the two countries' national interests and for the global interest, in which category I would place action on climate change, because these are the world's two largest emitters, action in terms of continued global financial stability, because they're the world's two largest economies and the two largest financial systems. And then thirdly, on top of that, action together in managing the next global pandemic, because regrettably, the one we've just all been through, traumatizing as it has been for all governments and peoples around the world, it won't be the last pandemic, and we need to do a better job in terms of managing the next major global public health crisis as well. So John, that in a nutshell is what the book is about. And I'm happy to open it up to wherever you would now wish to take the conversation. Over to you.
Maybe to start off with, this relationship between the United States and China really has reverberating consequences all around the world. What do you think the basis is for this new rivalry, where we've had the strategic personal relationships have deteriorated so considerably? Is it cultural misunderstanding? Is it historical grievance? Or is it just simple ideological incompatibility?
I think the underpinning driving force in this, John, is actually the balance of power. it's a classical concept in international relations theory. If we went back 10, 20, 30 years, the balance of power between the United States and China, regionally and globally, was overwhelmingly in favor of the United States. But because of China's rapid growth in military capabilities, its economic footprint, both regionally and globally, its emergence as a global technological power, that balance is now much more finely tuned. And when you get down to the regional dynamics of it, for example, in East Asia and the West Pacific, at a military level, our American and Chinese expert colleagues would tell us that in fact that balance of power is now tipping towards China. And the second and related reason why this is ultimately driving the dynamics of the relationship, John, is if you look carefully at the nature of Xi Jinping's domestic ideological pronouncements, what he has said is that as of about 2013, Deng Xiaoping's ancient notion of hide your strength, bide your time, never take the lead, has now yielded to a new Xi Jinping doctrine of China in the world, which is explicitly and consciously more assertive, not simply through, as it were, leadership choice, because Xi Jinping is now confident that China has more power in all domains to leverage in the execution of its interests and its values in the world. And if there's a final dimension to it, John, it's what you touched on at the end, which is there is an ideological underpinning to this. China does not accept the inherent legitimacy of an international rules-based order based on the United States and in large part its democratic allies, reflected in the current status of the UN Charter, the universality of human rights, as well as the current construction of the Bretton Woods institutions. China wishes to see those norms, institutional arrangements, and values change in a manner more compatible with China's own national interests and national values, in the same sort of way as they saw, in their view, the United States doing after 1945.
Xi is a very different leader than we've ever seen from China, and you're right, he's definitely being much more assertive globally. There's a lot of bullhorn diplomacy, heated political rhetoric. I can recall when the Winter Olympics were held in China, someone said to me, well, countries like China shouldn't be allowed to host the Olympics. And I said, well, of the 193 countries at the UN, that would probably disqualify 150. How can the United States better engage with Xi and the senior leadership in Beijing? And does Canada have room to have a more independent foreign policy that we've had, for example, since Pierre Trudeau established full diplomatic relations with Peking, even before Nixon or Kissinger went to China?
I think in the overall dynamics of the US and China relationship, the principal driving force for change over the last decade has been Xi Jinping's China itself, rather than, as it were, discrete individual initiatives of the United States, either under Democrat or Republican administrations. In other words, China is seeking to change the status quo, and the United States, under successive administrations since 2012, has pushed back in an effort to preserve the strategic and global institutional status quo. So therefore, I do not believe that there is a whole lot of room for simply, quote, more understanding of each other. I think if you were to sit in a room and you and I were to pull out a bottle of something with our Chinese and American counterparts and have a broader bilateral conversation with them, then what we'd soon discover is that, frankly, underneath it all, they understand each other full well. They understand that this is a increasingly bare-knuckled engagement for which country emerges between 2035 and 2049 as the world's and the region's dominant power. And the question of third countries you touched on, like Canada, like Australia and others, I think all countries in the wider region would, of course, prefer not to be placed in the position of making an ultimate strategic choice between Beijing and Washington. But the reality is the dynamics of the relationship itself between the two principals, Washington and Beijing, is now such that it is, by nature of force, causing countries to increasingly make that binary choice. For example, let us look at how the nations of the world have lined up on the question of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. China has refused to condemn the invasion. China says that it is neutral on the invasion. China is in the process of expanding as much by way that it can of its commodity imports from the Russian Federation in order to enhance its own ability to provide a hard currency to the Russian Federation by medium of still legal trade. On the other hand, when you've had also condemnations through the Human Rights Council, by the UN Security Council, UN General Assembly, of the violations brought about by Russia in the invasion initially and the subsequent attempted occupation of parts of Ukraine, once again, China has refused to back any of those moves by those international institutions. So whether we like it or not, as it were, the different positions, the battle lines, if you like, are being drawn. And if you look at the pattern of votes in the Security Council and in the General Assembly and in the Human Rights Council in Geneva, it is quite plain that these are becoming increasingly, not exclusively, but increasingly binary positions. So whether we like it or not, we are increasingly drawn into a binary and bipolar world. It doesn't preclude the possibility of continued open economic relationships with China, working with China in global institutions like the G20 to act collaboratively on questions such as climate change. That is all still possible, but we cannot wish away the underlying bipolar nature, the binary nature of the geopolitical world, which is emerging between these two great countries.
Do you think that Washington is going to come down hard on Western allies who try to take a more open approach to more of a high-level engagement with China, compartmentalizing, say, human rights or trade?
The United States around the world has something like 46 treaty allies in both Asia and in Europe, of which our two countries, Canada and Australia, are among the oldest continuing allies. I think the United States in alliance management will continue to exhibit a level of flexibility and creativity and mindfulness of domestic political circumstances in each of its alliance partners. But at the same time, below the surface, is going to be increasingly clear-cut about where it would wish its allies to line up on core questions of geopolitics and geoeconomics and the future of the international system, which is being brought about in this increasingly binary struggle between Beijing and Washington. It doesn't mean that all countries, therefore, will be required as a provision of their alliance relationship to comply with each and every individual aspect of US foreign policy. But your question is, will the US increasingly have that as an expectation? I think that will be increasingly the case, but within the absence of, shall I say, public coercion. And remember, China does not have a parallel challenge because, as Chinese colleagues have said to me over the years, how come the United States ended up with all the good allies in the world and we ended up with North Korea? So there's not a big question of alliance management when it comes to Beijing's structure of international partnerships around the world, although China has no qualms about maximizing the deployment of its own global economic leverage on countries across Africa, Latin America, South Asia, and most recently Australia, and seeking to have those countries comply with China's underlying foreign policy interests.
Do you think the lack of personal engagement by foreign ministers and leaders like yourself when you were in power, the lack of engagement is not putting at risk that we could see a flashpoint or even kinetic action at some point in the Asia-Pacific region?
I think history should be in part our guide here, John. Both your country and mine got thrown into the carnage of the Great War in 1914 through a monumental failure of diplomacy. In the critical month of July 1914, between the assassination of the Archduke, if you like, the triggering crisis of June, late June 1914, and the guns of August on the 4th of August. And in part, the failure of diplomacy back then was because of the thinness of the rolling diplomatic interaction between the great powers at the time, to the point that each began to rely upon purely external signaling of its internal intents. Therefore, it was a monumental exercise and illustration of what I call an utterly avoidable war, ending up in global carnage and a global rewrite of the international rules-based system as a result. My Australian colleague, a distinguished scholar from Cambridge, Christopher Clark, in 2014-15 wrote this book, The Sleepwalkers, which is how the European great powers sleptwalked into war in those critical months of 1914. And part of the burden of this book, John, is to simply argue, let's not sleepwalk again. The principal actors in this are Beijing and Washington, whether we like it or not, you and I coming from significant third countries. And so this book actually is an epistle, if you like, an argument about how to reduce the risk of accidental crisis, escalation, conflict, and war through a decade which I describe, the 2020s, as the decade of living dangerously, when there is a potential crossover in the balance of power between these two countries of the type we've not seen in 100 years, when the United States emerged as the dominant power over the United Kingdom back in the late 19th and early 20th centuries.
Before we open it up, Peter, we'll open it up to questions from our attendees. Let me throw this at you. Your book was written before the crisis with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. What do you think that President Xi and Beijing has learned by the entire world's reaction to the invasion and the events on the ground in Ukraine? And how would that affect their decisions and thoughts about further action in the China Sea or, God forbid, Taiwan?
You're right, John. The book I put the finishing touches to in December. And of course, February 4 was when Putin traveled to Beijing to sign what is now a famous joint declaration of strategic cooperation between China and the Russian Federation. And the subsequent invasion of Ukraine unfolded about 2 weeks after that. However, there is a significant section of the book which deals with the China-Russia relationship, as I seek to define what I describe as Xi Jinping's 10 concentric circles of interest, one of which is to have a benign relationship with its 14 land neighbors, principal among which is Russia, and to therefore preference the priority of that relationship in all of its engagements with the world at large. What has Xi Jinping learned from what Vladimir Putin and the Russians have now done and subsequently experienced in the invasion of Ukraine? I think underneath it all, there are probably 2 or 3 lessons now being analyzed by the Chinese system, in particular the military, but also the Chinese financial establishment as well. Number one is invading a country, even those with whom you share a land border, is no easy thing. This was not simply the United States rolling over Iraq as they did in the 2003 invasion of Iraq. This has in fact involved a nation, Russia, seeking to bring about a land invasion within a matter of days to conquer the capital of a neighboring state. And the Chinese takeout is, this is no easy thing. This is not going to simply turn out to be an exercise in automatic capitulation. And in the case of Taiwan, the extrapolation is, for God's sake, that was a land border. The Taiwan Straits is a 180-kilometer maritime border, which would require China to embark upon the biggest amphibious operation in global military history since the D-Day landings. So the degree of difficulty of the execution of the military task will be weighing heavily on the minds of Chinese military planners. The second point is the swiftness of US and allied financial sanctions against the Russian Federation. One of the reasons why I've always argued that there is no imminent threat against Taiwan is that China, for the foreseeable future, remains itself subject to the US dollar-denominated international financial system. And the and the settlement system, otherwise called SWIFT, from which Russia has recently been unceremoniously removed. And the bottom line is China cannot afford for that to happen now, but China will seek to become more independent financially, potentially through the floating of the RMB, its currency, and potentially through the opening of its capital account towards the end of this decade, to put it in a position where it is not as vulnerable as Russia now has proven to be. And finally, I think Beijing has been surprised that the Europeans in particular, who they've always seen as a bunch of strategic marshmallows, have actually decided to cohere in political and military support for Ukraine through the machinery of NATO, but also a range of bilateral arrangements as well with Kiev. And as a result, the Chinese assumption that the West was in automatic structural decline and had no strategic backbone is being challenged as well. Do any of these three factors cause Xi Jinping to ultimately change his preferred timetable on Taiwan, which I argue to be in his mind late 20s and early 30s? I'm not sure about that, but it will certainly give his strategic and financial planners something to reflect on over the couple of years which lie ahead.
Thank you, Kevin. Let's turn it over to you, Peter, to get questions from our participants.
Yeah, thanks very, very much, John and Kevin. We've got some great questions coming on the Q&A, and let me ask you a form of one of them, Kevin. And John, I'd love to hear your view on this as well as a close watcher of the US. But Kevin, how much of this, the advice you're giving in some sense, and the framework that you're setting up, depends on the US remaining in effect a healthy liberal democracy? I think there are, if you were betting on the US doing well as a democracy, I don't think you'd be wrong, but there are warning signs that US democracy is not performing as we might want it to, that the capacity for there to be big bipartisan agreements, for example, on foreign policy goals and on big picture stuff is less than it was a number of years ago, quite apart from just the sort of normal kind of paralysis that we see rather in Congress on matters of foreign affairs. So just in short, how much of the framework that you're setting up depends on the US continuing to function as well as it has functioned over the last 50 years?
I think the first thing, Peter, is that the book is intended for audiences both in Beijing and Washington, because it takes two to tango in global geopolitics when you're dealing with two great powers. And what I recommend is a joint strategic framework which can be interpretable as manageable in terms of the interests of both countries, not just the United States. Because it's my underlying assumption that during the 2020s, Xi Jinping does not have an underlying interest in bringing on crisis, conflict, and war, because from the Chinese perspective, frankly, they're not ready for it. But nor does the United States. But both are, as I would argue in the book, vulnerable to accidental crisis, conflict, and war, given how threadbare the relationship is between them. The second point, going to the United States itself, is as follows. You're absolutely right about the polarized nature of the US body politic. I spend most of my time living and working in New York, from time to time in Washington, where we, the Asia Society, also have a center. And I deal quite a lot with various members of the Congress and the administration and the previous administration under Donald Trump. Nonetheless, depending on the nature of the emerging US China strategy, which Secretary of State Blinken will be speaking of in the days ahead. In fact, he's delivering a speech through our Washington Center of the Asia Society in the next few days. Then that itself will determine whether in fact there is a sufficiently high degree of Republican and Democrat lock-in. When I go through Capitol Hill, it is quite surprising the degree to which even some of the more conservative Republicans have a high degree of bipartisan instinct when it comes to aggregate US-China strategy. That would not be the case if Trump were to be re-elected in 2024, nor if it were to be a Trump-like figure in 2024. But in terms of the rest of the Republican establishment, who are not currently in the majority, but I think the bulk of representation from the Republican caucus in the House and the Senate, there is a high degree of, shall I say, instinctive bipartisanship on this single issue, probably to the exclusion of all others in foreign and domestic policy in the United States. John?
I would never write off the United States. The institutions of the United States are very strong and resilient, and they responded to the last presidential election, and they responded very effectively on January 6th, when the sitting vice president stood with the Democratic Speaker of the House and into the night to certify the election results. So I would not sell out the United States. It's funny, the China issue is probably the single most uniting issue that exists in Washington. I think Chuck Schumer was pretty much identical in his views on China and Xi. Got your mic on, Peter.
Thank you. Without my only job, without asking you to look too far in your crystal ball, Kevin, but what would happen under a Trump presidency? Because you suggested that bipartisan consensus might take a different configuration under a Trump presidency or a Trump-like figure. Can you just walk us through what your thinking is there?
Well, if, for example, hypothetically, Trump was to recontest in 2024 and to win, and I, on the balance of probabilities, do not accept the argument that he will run in 2024. I think he'd be more predisposed to have someone who would be politically prepared to do his bidding run instead in 2024. But let's go to the premise that it's Trump himself. To the extent that past behavior is the best predictor of future behavior, what do we know from the previous Trump administration of 2016, 2020? One, it's monumentally unpredictable. Two, it doesn't really care all that much about allies, given the amount of grief, for example, that you in Canada went through with the renegotiation of NAFTA, that the Asian allies led by Japan and Korea went through with the renegotiation of basing agreements with the United States, driven by Trump personally. And Trump's effective directive to the US military to undertake a US military withdrawal from NATO and Europe. At the same time, when COVID erupted, you then had Trump reducing the U.S. China bilateral relationship to a screaming match in both directions because it didn't suit Trump's underpinning political interest for his own re-election in 2020. And thirdly, on the question of human rights, Trump could not have cared less about human rights in China. If you asked Trump to take a position on the Uyghurs or on Tibet or any other aspect of Chinese human rights abuses, he would never have done so. And so for those reasons, the essential problem for allies in dealing with the Trump administration, Trump 1 or Trump 2, is its essential internal incoherence because of the essential incoherence of the man himself. Allied management of Trump is a full-time job and therefore takes your attention away from the main game, which is managing the relationships collectively with rising China. Anyway, that would be my view.
I'd say just two things. One, we need, both Kevin and I worked with Hillary Clinton, and there we had two things, predictability and competence. And those are two important factors. Maybe
in short supply sometimes, yeah?
On occasion.
In the same people. You talked, Kevin, very helpfully about the role of kind of third countries or smaller countries, and Canada and Australia fall into that category. Can you tell us where you see some of the bigger rising powers in this dynamic? India, for example, but also I'd love to hear your thoughts on where a country like Indonesia is going to fit into this, or other large countries that are geographically in the orbit of China, but are interested in in asserting their own independence and charting their own way.
Well, Peter, you're an expert in politics and international relations, and the school of thought, which is that when you have changes in the global balance of power, one or other of two tendencies unfold. Third countries either bandwagon with the emerging dominant power, or they coalesce to balance against that rising power in order to preserve strategic equilibrium and greater autonomy for themselves. So balancing and bandwagoning are the two operational concepts that you see writ large across multiple chapters of international relations history. So applied to the China case and across the Indo-Pacific and the Asia-Pacific, but also including the world at large, I think we do see those two principles at work as well. Going to the first of them, which is balancing against China's rise, given China's power is greater, given China's assertiveness is more pronounced, as we've discussed earlier in this seminar, the bottom line is what you see from a range of other countries around the world is now a series of concerted actions to balance against Beijing. This is led in particular by the Quad, which emerged as a broad, as it were, foreign policy talk shop only a couple of years ago. But following China's military engagement against India on the Sino-Indian border in April, May, June of 2020, New Delhi decided that it needed to engage in overt balancing against Beijing by formally elevating the Quad to summit level and giving it a comprehensive agenda in security policy, foreign policy, and frankly, in development policy as well. Therefore, when you have countries such as India, Japan, the United States, and Australia becoming part of this balancing operation, it is a significant geopolitical development. And as I read Chinese responses to it, they see it in those terms as well. Similarly, you could see innovations such as AUKUS, which brings together Australia, the United Kingdom, the United States, within a similar frame. But at the same time, if I look more closely at the geopolitics of others within the Indo-Pacific and beyond, you will see others not, as it were, bandwagoning, but at least hedging between the two propositions. The countries of Southeast Asia, you referred to Indonesia in this case, is very much into hedging mode, seeing the great power dynamics currently unfolding, not knowing which way is ultimately going to land, not yet bandwagoning with China, but having a very mindful set of eyes on which way these dynamics could unfold.
It's deeply concerning to me, Peter, that on all those alliances that Kevin spoke of, Canada's not at the table. We're missing in action, and that's not good for our long-term strategic interest. That's something critical. Let me say something complimentary. Foreign Affairs Minister Melanie Joly proactively reached out to Wang Yi, and I understand they had a very productive bilateral meeting over Zoom. And good on her for being proactive in that. And let's hopefully that can jumpstart the re-engagement with China following the release of the two Michaels.
John, I was wondering if I could put you on the spot to ask you the question you just answered without my asking it. So can I ask you a follow-up?
Absolutely.
Which is Kevin, if you don't mind, be indulging John for a second. Which is what should Canada be doing in the medium term? I mean, all these things are happening, and we're kind of trying to get to the party a bit late, right? But if we're thinking about this over 5, 10, 15, 20 years, where should Canada be putting its energy in this managed competition between China and the US?
I was strongly supportive of the first Prime Minister Trudeau's unprecedented engagement with China long before the United States did, and I think we need to pursue our own independent foreign policy and put aside the bullhorn, put aside the heated rhetoric, and return to a predictable, competent policy. I think we made a mistake when we were going to launch free trade discussions with China, when we wanted a progressive trade deal. Premier Lee was quite angry with Canada when we said no on Aecon, the sale of a construction company. National security grounds, that was the second smack, and then of course the arrest of Madam Meng and the competence that lacked in our handling of that. So let's hope we need to see re-engagement at the top. And I think it's going to be hard for the Prime Minister too, but let's hope our diplomats and our Foreign Minister can do that.
Kevin, this is a time when I think the importance of political leadership, the agency is clearer in the world now than it has been for the last little while. The leadership of Zelensky in Ukraine is pivotal to what's happening there. Clearly, Russia's invasion wasn't inevitable. It was a political choice made by a political individual. So it just in the spirit of that, and we've talked about American leadership, I want to probe, if we can, a little bit Xi Jinping, and I want to ask how much of the kind of the framework that China has set up around decoupling, around shared prosperity, for example, or common prosperity. How much of this is about Xi, and how much of it is actually widely shared, such that if he leaves the scene, is it a reset of everything, or does it just continue apace?
Xi Jinping is China's paramount leader and is not simply an element of a collective leadership. And that is where he is quite different from Hu Jintao and Jiang Zemin, who preceded him. And I would argue is more of a paramount leader now than Deng Xiaoping was when Deng Xiaoping was at the height of his powers. In the Deng Xiaoping period, Deng still had senior, as it were, leaders of the revolutionary age who were in office with him, with whom in the conventions of this Marxist-Leninist party, the Chinese Communist Party, he was required to consult and build consensus. That is no longer the case. And that is a product of the successful prosecution of Machiavellian politics by Xi Jinping internally within the Chinese Communist Party over the last 9 years, as successive waves of his opponents at the political and military and public security apparatus level have been removed and in some cases liquidated. The Marxist-Leninist nature of the Chinese Communist Party is not for shrinking violets. It is an institution which believes that you obtain and sustain power through the barrel of a gun, as Mao once said. On Xi Jinping's particular worldview, however, Peter, it's important for us to understand that he does represent a change from China's previous trajectory, and a big one, and one which does not necessarily enjoy support across the rest of the body politic within the CCP. If I was trying to give a thumbnail sketch of what are the big changes under Xi Jinping, if we were sitting in a debate somewhere in the Chinese leadership compound in Beijing at the moment over a glass of Mao Tai with my good friend John Baird, a Chinese counterpart, and others who were able to engage in a free-flowing conversation about what's the problem with Xi Jinping's leadership, they would probably summarize it in these terms. One, Xi Jinping has taken the politics of China far too far to the left, and the reassertion of the power of the party over the liberty of individuals. Second, he's also moved the center of gravity of Chinese economic policy to the left, to the point that Chinese private firms, whether it's Alibaba, Tencent, JD, or others like Didi, the major tech platforms, but other major private sector players, are now, as it were, under a series of regulatory and political attacks in a manner which was not the case under Deng, Jiang, and Hu. And that actually has an impact, frankly, on the success and the future of China's economic growth model and the levels of future economic growth we can expect out of the Chinese system. And the third big change is to push Chinese nationalism to the right as an underpinning force behind a more assertive foreign policy, quite apart from the objective military underpinnings of China's foreign policy power. Now, each of these decisions to shift where China's previous consensus of decision-making lay has brought about its own set of reactions internally. The one which is most acute has been a shift on the economy because it is slowing the growth rate. And there's an accusation against Xi Jinping domestically that he is undermining China's long-term power by beginning to retard its economic growth. Growth now being down to 4. Wasn't that long ago before China's growth was double-digit. Wasn't that long ago since it was 6 to 7. Now we're talking about numbers of 3 to 4. And the medium-term projection of that in terms of where Chinese GDP stands in a decade's time on 3 or 4% growth as opposed to 5 or 6% growth are profound. And the other one where you see a lot of emerging dissension within the Chinese system, expressed in the arcane methods of Chinese public policy debate through the organs of the Chinese Communist Party, is overreach in terms of the personal relationship with Putin and Russia. And so these things will be at work between now and the 20th Party Congress to be held this November, when the decision will be taken on extending to Xi Jinping a third term.
John, anything to add on your end on this?
I just think we got to recognize that Xi is a different kind of leader. I think we need to also, I mean, we can have profound and honest disagreements on some of the agenda items and the way he's dealt with the Uyghurs, Hong Kong, the rhetoric on Taiwan. I do think, though, that whether it's President Biden, Prime Minister Trudeau, Xi Jinping, Vladimir Putin, they all get up with number one objective is to stay in power. But I actually think that I would say that Vladimir Putin, his number two objective is not to do great things for the Russian people. Where I think President Biden, Prime Minister Trudeau, and Xi Jinping genuinely want to accomplish things for their people, including the continued poverty eradication. I would keep that in mind when dealing with him.
So, Kevin, looking forward to November, I mean, I think you could, if you were a betting man, you could place bets on whether Xi Jinping would remain in power for a lot longer. And I imagine you might bet that. But suppose he's not. I mean, you've articulated where he's outside in some sense of the preferences of his party, or outside of their mainstream in some sense. But how quick is the snapback? Which is to say, if there was a big course correction, how quickly does it happen? And does it happen in a way that actually changes the fundamentals of what you're recommending, or is this kind of framework of managed competition still the best way forward, even without this leftward lurch from Xi?
Well, as you know, we Australians never bet and we don't drink, so it's very culturally challenging for me to enter this space and to do either. But let me just hazard a guess as to what such an Australian might do. I think on the balance of probabilities, Peter, is that Xi Jinping will emerge as China's leader of the Communist Party after November. The real question at this stage is less that, even though the opposition to him is growing. The real question for those of us who have to analyse this stuff will be, and who else gets elected to the Standing Committee and the rest of the Politburo around him? A bunch of patsies, or B, people who will represent different worldviews on each of the three sets of issues I ran through before. That, I think, is now where the real political action lies, in the central leadership debates of the Chinese Communist Party. And the second point that you raise is therefore this concept of managed strategic competition applicable to the current Xi Jinping administration. Is it equally applicable to something which may be qualitatively different? I think it's applicable to both Republican and Democrat administrations in the US and different variations of the Chinese Communist Party in Beijing in the current circumstances, because what we need is a stabilizing mechanism for the bilateral relationship as viewed by both countries for the remainder of the 2020s. As I said, the 2030s is when we enter into an even more dangerous terrain over the Taiwan question. And Xi Jinping's determination to be, quote, a man of history, to achieve the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, which the Chinese have said explicitly, quote, cannot be achieved in the absence of Taiwan. So you don't have to be a Rhodes Scholar to work out that that means some action to bring Taiwan back. And what I'm therefore most concerned about is the 2030s. Avoiding accidental war in the 2020s is a precondition for that. But the 2030s is something which will become even more problematic, and where classical questions such as military and financial deterrence, as we discussed earlier, Peter, in terms of lessons emerging from Ukraine, will be the dominant considerations as to whether Xi Jinping ultimately pushes the Taiwan button.
Do you see the Chinese internalizing those lessons in the medium term from Ukraine? I mean, this is. Or is it? Do you think they're going to revert to form in terms of, their plans on Taiwan, for example?
Xi Jinping is not easily, as Margaret Thatcher said of herself once famously, not a lady easy for turning. Well, he's not a man easy for turning, because the problem with men of history, quote unquote, a term I'm always uncomfortable with, because it's a predisposition to radically change the status quo, is that his overwhelming ideological and political and nationalist wiring is to proceed in this direction. That's why the question of who is selected around him to form the rest of the Chinese leadership elite is so critical. because there will be dissenting voices. The question is how loud and authoritative they will be allowed to be. The Chinese Communist Party, Peter, is capable of course correction. The question, though, under Xi Jinping, because he is numero uno, and when his power as at present is unchallenged, is the preparedness of senior officials to present him with alternative policy courses. They've been seeking, for example, to reposition on the economy for the last 6 months by undoing a number of the decisions already taken on common prosperity, on the role of private firms, etc. But it has been a very uneven, shall we say, pivot to a new policy direction, because the voices are now completely at odds with each other internally. That's being reflected externally. In the case of the Chinese private sector, once bitten, twice shy. Why should I now reinvest in the economy in the future when I've seen the color of Xi Jinping's money in the last 2 years? I didn't like the color that I saw. So there are those dynamics at play as well, Peter.
Just to wrap up, I'd like to ask you both about the role of democracies in some sense. And Kevin, I heard you speak very eloquently about this at the launch event in New York last month. And this is a competition that you're talking about, and it's a competition over values, over how countries organize themselves. And I think that you happen to believe that in the end, in this managed competition, democracies can come out on top. Why do you have that faith? What's your sense about what is going to set us apart? And in that sense, what are the things we have to make sure that we're maintaining and prizing within these democratic societies that are involved in this, on one side of this managed strategic competition?
Yeah, you're right to say, Peter, that I do see the ideational debate, as the Chinese would frame it, the ideological debate, is in fact central to the unfolding dynamic of the strategic competition, not just between the United States and China, but between a US or Chinese-led international order where liberal democratic norms and values are accorded a particular priority. If you want to ask, well, where is that the case in the current international rules-based system? Well, if you look at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, that's part of the current order. That's why we've got a Human Rights Council, however ineffective, in Geneva. But it is currently part of the normative structure of that which we do. China's active diplomacy at present is to undermine that element of the order. And you don't, again, have to be forensic in your analysis to see that happening day in, day out in councils around the world. So whether we like it or not, our Marxist-Leninist friends in Beijing are engaged in that ideational/ideological contest. The second question is whether the democratic world, and I use that word rather than the West, because the West, in the eyes of the East, is basically a representation of a series of former colonial powers, which has a whole bunch of other representational significances in the overall exchange with the Chinese leadership. But for the democratic world, the challenge is simply this: do we actually believe in the intrinsic virtue and value and vitality of the principle of free societies, free economies, and free polities? Or do we think this is simply a passing phase in the evolution of human history? If you look at the unfolding dynamic of, let's call it the freedom project over the last several centuries, since the Enlightenment really, it has been hard fought around the world. And whereas I've never subscribed to a Fukuyama-esque view of history, that constitutes therefore the end point, and everyone should just go home and crack open a beer because all over, Red Rover, done, that's the end. This is an enduring contest between the articulations of those freedoms across our societies and across the international system writ large. Neither Vladimir Putin nor Xi Jinping support that set of ideational propositions at all and are engaged in a contest against them. Why do I have confidence that the democratic world may still rise and is the process of rising to that occasion? Look at Ukraine. People have once again rediscovered that there is something at stake here. However flawed domestic Ukrainian politics may be, they did have elections. They elected Zelensky. No one has challenged his intrinsic mandate other than the Russians. And furthermore, he's used the mandate, I think John and I would agree on this, superbly as a national political leader in galvanizing his people around not just the sovereignty of his nation, but also about the importance of the democratic ideal and the preservation of a democratically elected government of Ukraine on the way through. So as a barometer of resolve, I think it is not an insignificant one.
John, any closing comments on your end on that question?
I think you can't, when you're a foreign minister, you have to deal with values and you have to deal with interests. I became liberal democracy, perhaps not as important as freedom, human rights, pluralism, prosperity, as being the underpinnings that are what we're looking for. I think too often Canadians try to be holier than thou, and we can't exclusively be looking at values. Yes, they're incredibly important. Yes, we fundamentally have different values with Beijing. Having said that, we have Canadian interests as well. We have, these democracies have interests. We have interest in economy and trade. We have interest on confronting the challenges in global public health, where we need to engage with China. We have the challenge of confronting the potential of a nuclear armed Iran. We have to confront climate change. We have to ensure that international institutions are effective and work. And all of those things require engagement with President Xi and his government. And we need to go in with both eyes wide open.
Kevin, a final word to you if you'd like one.
Yeah, well, John is absolutely right. I mean, those of us who have been in office, Prime Minister or Foreign Minister of, in our case, middle powers, you don't have the luxury of a binary choice. Is it values today and interests tomorrow? Our requirement in the democratic countries which we have led in one form or another has been to walk and chew gum at the same time. However, where the Russians and the Chinese would like to take us all at the end of the day is into a series of micro negotiations on interests and the suspension of anything associated with the concept of values. Their ultimate argument is that all values are ultimately national and constrained within a nation state, and there is therefore nothing for the rest of us to say about the actions of an external government against its own people. Well, of course, the extreme manifestation of that was our collective silence in the face of the unfolding Holocaust against Jews in Germany and then in wider occupied Europe in the 1930s, and as it unfolded further. An international community, through a series of resolutions, including the International Responsibility to Protect, has evolved a different set of beliefs about the importance of intervening to prevent Srebrenica from happening again, to prevent Rwanda from happening again, and to therefore deploy mechanisms such as the International Criminal Court when you see such egregious violations of the human rights under international law of civilians in Ukraine. So we therefore are required to walk on both these paths at the same time. China and the Russian Federation do not have that view. And that of itself constitutes an ideational/ideological divide between us. So do we have the guts to prosecute both, being pragmatic about our national interests, but also being sufficiently robust in the articulation of our values? Look, despite the fact that we are an untidy group of nations, we in the democratic world, because democracies are inherently untidy operations. You want tidiness? Go to the Bolsheviks. If you want real tidiness, go to the internal machinery of the Chinese Communist Party. Not a big sense of humor, but it's very tidy. And the bottom line is our job is to, frankly, manage the complexity of values and interests rather than simply to say it's all about interests. If that is the case, then I think we end up in an imperiled world.
Kevin, I want to thank you very much for joining us. John, very much to you as well for hosting this talk. You've both been great friends to the Monk School over the years, and I appreciate that personally very much. But more than that, very much appreciate both of you who've been really global leaders as ministers of foreign affairs and in other roles, of course, and both of you continue to be. So we're all in your debt for that. Kevin's book, The Avoidable War, The Dangers of a Catastrophic Conflict Between the U.S. and Xi Jinping's China, is available from Public Affairs Books. You can get it on any whatever platform you choose, whether in hard copy or on your device. And I encourage you to read it. I want to thank all of you for joining us, for sending in your questions. And Kevin and John, I hope we can have both of you back to the school in person before too long. But until then, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Thanks, John, and all the best to all those who have joined us today.
Cheers.